Hello everyone. Tonight, we step into a realm of strange mysteries, where stories that seem ordinary at first glance suddenly twist into unexpected tragedy. So before you settle in and get comfortable, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the mysterious. And don't forget to leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight. It's always fascinating to see how we connect from all around the world. Now, dim the lights, let the atmosphere grow still, and together let's embark on tonight's journey into the unknown. Number 1. The Challenger disaster. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger rose into a crystal blue Florida sky from Kennedy Space Center. On board were 7 highly trained astronauts, each embarking on either their first or second journey into space. But just over 1 minute after leaving the launch pad, Challenger erupted into a massive fireball, followed by a billowing cloud of debris scattering across the heavens. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. A failure that, as it would later emerge, a few engineers on the ground had warned about long before launch. Challenger was the second shuttle built by NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the agency responsible for America's civilian space program and much of its aeronautical and space research. During the 1950s and 1960s, NASA's earliest missions relied on expendable launch vehicles, ESEM, rockets designed for a single use. One of the main goals of the Space Shuttle program, initiated in the 1970s, was to create a partially reusable, reliable vehicle capable of repeated launches. Challenger became the second such orbiter to be constructed. Like her predecessor Columbia, Challenger consisted of 3 major components: a reusable orbiter, 2 solid rocket boosters that could be recovered and used again, and a single expendable external fuel tank. Only the orbiter itself reached space. The other elements were jettisoned during ascent. After completing its mission, the orbiter would glide unpowered back to Earth, be refurbished, and prepared for future flights. Throughout its service life, Challenger completed 9 successful missions and achieved several milestones. It carried the first American woman into space in 1983, as well as the first African-American astronaut. It conducted the first night launch in shuttle history and became the first to capture, repair, and redeploy a satellite while in orbit. Mission STS-51L was to be Challenger's 10th flight and the 25th overall in the shuttle program. Its objectives were threefold: to deploy a small satellite, to make observations of Halley's Comet, and to send a schoolteacher into orbit to deliver 2 live lessons from space. A symbolic effort under the Teacher in Space project, meant to inspire educators and students alike with a renewed passion for exploration. Originally scheduled for January 23, 1986, the launch was postponed several times, first due to delays in another mission, then because of poor weather. Eventually, the decision was made to proceed on January 28, despite an unusually cold night that left the launch pad coated in ice. The astronauts boarded. Mission Control gave the final go-ahead. At 11:38 a.m., the solid rockets ignited, and Challenger leapt skyward in a column of smoke and flame. Thousands watched in person, and millions more via live broadcast. 73 seconds later, tragedy struck. A blinding fireball consumed the shuttle. Communications ceased instantly. The explosion, Challenger, broadcast live across the nation, obliterated Challenger. The 2 solid rocket boosters, still intact, spiraled out of control for several seconds before ground controllers, fearing they might veer toward populated areas, triggered their self-destruct sequences. As horrified spectators looked on from the beaches and television screens, debris rained down into the Atlantic. For more than 15 minutes, the deadly rain made any rescue attempt impossible. When it finally subsided, search teams parachuted into the area to locate the crew cabin. When the compartment was recovered, all hope vanished. All 7 astronauts had perished. Evidence later revealed they had survived the initial explosion, remaining conscious long enough to activate their emergency oxygen and attempt to restore control. But they could do nothing to prevent the cabin's catastrophic fall into the ocean. Those 7 were Commander Francis Scobie, Pilot Michael Smith, Mission Specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair, Payload Specialist Gregory Jarvis, and high school teacher Krista McAuliffe, RES, the winner of a nationwide competition to become the first teacher to give a lesson from space. That evening, President Ronald Reagan addressed the nation. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. A presidential commission was quickly formed to determine the cause of the disaster. Former Secretary of State William Rogers was appointed chairman, tasked by the president to investigate delicately so as not to discredit NASA. Yet one member refused to take that approach, Richard Feynman, the brilliant and iconoclastic theoretical physicist. Gravely ill with cancer, he nevertheless pursued an independent inquiry with unflinching resolve. Feynman's stubborn integrity soon uncovered the truth. Several NASA engineers and commission staff, fearful for their careers, leaked information to him indirectly. One evening, a fellow member invited Feynman to dinner and casually mentioned how rubber seals on car engines stiffened in cold weather, causing leaks, a metaphor that pointed him toward the fatal clue. The culprit was the O-ring seal in the shuttle's right solid rocket booster. The freezing temperature that morning had robbed it of flexibility, leaving a gap barely the thickness of a credit card. As the shuttle ascended, superheated gas escaped through that gap, igniting the external fuel tank and triggering the explosion. In a televised hearing, Feynman dramatically demonstrated the problem. He placed a sample O-ring in a glass of ice water, showing that once chilled, it could not regain its original shape, instantly conveying the cause of the disaster to the public without the need for complex science. Furthermore, engineers from the booster's manufacturer had explicitly warned NASA against launching in such cold conditions. Their warnings, however, were dismissed, later described as a breakdown in communication. Feynman's further investigation exposed a troubling management culture at NASA. Senior officials consistently underestimated risks, misrepresented failure probabilities, and scheduled flights under unrealistic pressure, ignoring the cautions of their own experts. The Rogers Commission's final report made numerous recommendations, most of which NASA implemented. During the 32-month suspension that followed, shuttle design was overhauled, safety and quality control systems were strengthened, and launch schedules were adjusted to allow for greater caution. Although these reforms made subsequent missions safer, they could never eliminate risk entirely. The Challenger tragedy would not be the last disaster in humanity's quest for the stars. The remains of the crew were cremated and interred together at Arlington National Cemetery, where a bronze memorial bears their likenesses. Each January, NASA observes a day of remembrance to honor those lost in spaceflight accidents, 2C FIDE, a solemn occasion to commemorate their courage and to remind all who continue that mission never to forget the hard-earned lessons written in the ashes of Challenger. Number 2. The Gothenburg Discothèque disaster. On October 29, 1998, a fire broke out inside a community center in the city of Gothenburg, Sweden. That night, the venue was said to be hosting a private birthday party for around 50 people. But when firefighters arrived, they were met with a horrifying reality. The building was packed with more than 4 times that number, and many inside had already lost their chance to survive. The venue was owned by the Macedonian Association, a cultural organization serving Sweden's immigrant community. The group regularly rented out the space for birthdays, dance events, and community gatherings. It was a modest second-floor hall in a 2-story building shared with several other tenants, including a furniture store and a small theater. The main hall included a small kitchen, a coat room, an office, and a storage area. The second floor could be reached by a stairway at one end, with another staircase at the opposite end serving as an emergency exit. On the evening of October 29th, the entire space had been rented by a group of teenagers for what was described as a private birthday celebration. The Macedonian Association had been assured that the event would be quiet and limited to no more than 50 invited guests, friends and relatives only. They were told it was not a ticketed event and would not be open to the public. Believing it to be a small, private gathering, the association agreed to rent the hall without requiring special safety measures or notifying local fire authorities. Unfortunately, they had been deceived. The birthday party was in fact a Halloween dance for high school students. Flyers had been distributed across Gothenburg, advertising the event as open to anyone of secondary school age who could pay an entry fee. The official capacity of the hall was 150 people. That night, at least 375 teenagers crowded inside. To prepare for the crowd, organizers decorated the plaster walls with paper, set up a small stage for the DJ and lighting rig, rented a smoke machine, and covered some lamps with cardboard to dim the room for atmosphere. Every movable piece of furniture was pushed against the walls or piled into the emergency stairwell to make more space for dancing. Even so, the hall was packed shoulder to shoulder. As the night went on, more young people arrived, until many complained they could no longer move, let alone dance. Near midnight, the DJ opened the emergency stairwell door and was met with thick smoke billowing inside. Within seconds, smoke poured into the hall. He leapt onto the stage, grabbed the microphone, and shouted that there was a fire in the building, urging everyone to evacuate. At first, many didn't understand what was happening. Some smelled smoke but assumed it came from the machine, from someone smoking, or from overheated lights. Even those who tried to flee didn't know where to go. Half the crowd surged toward the main entrance, while the rest ran to the emergency exit. Kiev, already blocked by flames and smoke, the fire spread rapidly. Flames engulfed the stage, lights burst, and panic swept the room. Hundreds rushed toward the narrow main door, which jammed almost immediately. As some fell, others trampled over them, sealing the exit entirely. The DJ and several others realized they had no escape route left, so they smashed the windows and tried to climb out. Although the building was only 1 story above ground, escape was difficult. The hall had once been part of a factory, so the windows were high and narrow. Those trying to get out had to climb roughly 6 feet to open them, then squeeze through the narrow gap before falling nearly 16 feet onto the concrete below. Most who escaped this way were injured, but dozens survived because of it. When police and firefighters arrived, they encountered chaos. Survivors crowded around the building, blocking access. Others lay injured beneath the windows, forcing rescuers to move them before fire trucks could get close. Firefighters climbing the stairs had to pull multiple bodies aside just to clear a path. At the top of the stairwell, they found the exit blocked by a mass of people who had died trying to escape. Every time they dragged one body clear, another person pressed forward into the space. Several firefighters later recalled feeling desperate hands clutching at them, some pulling so hard they nearly tore off their breathing masks. Even as rescue operations were underway, controlling the crowd outside proved nearly impossible. Most of the survivors were teenagers in shock, reeling from the worst night of their lives. They gathered outside, furious that they believed rescuers were moving too slowly. Some tried to rush back into the burning building to save friends, obstructing the firefighters' path. Others, overwhelmed by grief, lashed out at those trying to help. One firefighter recalled being attacked by a group of youths after telling them that their friend, God, just carried out, was already gone. The number of injured was so overwhelming that ambulances quickly ran out. Many victims had to share vehicles, with only one medic and 1 or 2 oxygen masks for multiple patients. Local taxi and bus drivers volunteered to transport the less severely injured to hospitals. Despite the confusion and chaos, rescuers managed to save at least 70 people and provide medical aid to hundreds more. In the end, 63 young people lost their lives and 213 were injured. An investigation soon revealed the fire had been deliberately set. Someone had ignited a chair in the emergency stairwell. The flames spread quickly through the stacked furniture there, filling the corridor with smoke. When the door was opened, fresh air rushed in, fueling the blaze and sending it roaring straight into the main hall, creating an inferno that claimed dozens of lives. 2 years later, police arrested 4 suspects, FSS, all teenagers who had attended the party. The youngest was only 17. They confessed that they had been angry about being charged an entry fee despite knowing the organizers. As an act of revenge, they decided to set fire to a chair, intending only to end the party early. They never imagined their reckless act would destroy the building and kill scores of innocent people, including some of their own friends, all over a childish outburst about paying 50 Swedish kronor, roughly $5. All four were convicted of aggravated arson and sentenced to between 3 and 8 years in prison or juvenile detention. Though widely criticized as too lenient, those penalties were near the maximum allowed under Swedish law for offenders of their age. 10 years after the tragedy, a permanent memorial engraved with the victims' names was erected near the site of the fire. The building itself was repaired and continues to be used for other businesses today. Families of the victims, after burying their loved ones, established a non-profit organization to raise funds and support others affected by large-scale disasters. They also run educational programs for Swedish youth, teaching them about the unpredictable dangers of fire and the devastating consequences that can follow from one thoughtless, impulsive act. Number 3. The crash that killed Concorde. On July 25, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 lifted off from Paris bound for New York. The aircraft was a Concorde, the legendary supersonic airliner once celebrated around the world for its speed, elegance, and near-perfect punctuality. That sleek white jet had long stood as a symbol of wealth, success, luxury, and human aspiration. But on that fateful day, Concorde would come to represent something else entirely. It would mark the beginning of the end for the aircraft itself, and for every life aboard Flight 4590. The development of Concorde began in the 1950s as a daring joint venture between Britain and France in the optimistic decades following World War II. It would become the world's first supersonic passenger jet, capable of flying faster than the speed of sound and carrying travelers from London to New York in just over 3 hours. An astonishing achievement compared to the usual 8-hour transatlantic journey. To reach such speeds, virtually every part of the aircraft had to be reimagined. Its unique droop-nose design allowed pilots to see the runway during landing. The narrow fuselage and long, slender delta wings minimized drag. Even its paint was specialized. Every Concorde was painted pure white to reflect heat generated by air friction at supersonic velocity. With its sleek, futuristic lines, Concorde looked more like a spacecraft than an airliner. The public was enthralled. It became a living symbol of human ingenuity and ambition. Supersonic flight was the future. Concorde was the machine that would take humanity there. Flying on Concorde was as extraordinary as the aircraft itself. Tickets were exorbitantly priced, and passengers likened the experience to joining an exclusive club. Champagne and caviar, silverware engraved with the Concorde logo, and luxurious airport lounges reserved for the elite few. Cruising at altitudes so high that passengers could see the curvature of the Earth, Concorde flew faster than a bullet, so fast that one could depart London at sunset and arrive in New York before sunset the same day. In form and spirit, Concorde was a shining beacon of human progress. Yet behind its glamour lay a harsh economic truth. Development costs had spiraled out of control. ISA, from an original estimate of £70 million to over $1.3 billion. Manufacturers had planned to sell at least 100 aircraft. Only 20 were ever built. Despite its prestige, Concorde struggled to convince airlines. It was prohibitively expensive to operate, consumed fuel at a staggering rate, and produced sonic booms so loud it was banned from flying supersonic over land, restricted instead to routes over the ocean. Its cabin, while luxurious, could seat barely 100 passengers. Concorde was an engineering marvel, but a commercial failure, masterpiece, that outpaced its own era. Perhaps it would have faded away quietly with time, but the tragedy of July 25, 2000, brought that ending far sooner. That afternoon, Air France Flight 4590 was scheduled to depart Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris for JFK in New York. It was a charter flight arranged by a luxury tour company, carrying passengers to the departure point of a 15-day cruise, described as a once-in-a-lifetime journey. Just even caster. The skies had cleared after a morning shower, and spirits were high. The captain, Christian Marty, was a veteran pilot with over 13,000 flight hours. At 4:42 p.m., he asked his crew, "Are we ready?" Then began the final takeoff of his life. The Concorde accelerated down the runway, passing the point of no return. Seconds later, disaster struck. Flames erupted along the left wing, leaving a blazing trail behind the aircraft like a comet streaking across the runway. Air traffic controllers radioed in alarm, but it was already too late. If the pilots aborted takeoff, the jet risked colliding with a parked Boeing 747 carrying French President Jacques Chirac. Captain Marty had no choice but to pull back on the controls, lifting the burning aircraft into the air. But the damage was too severe. Hydraulics failed, power dropped, and the aircraft struggled to climb. Barely 200 feet above the ground, it remained airborne for less than 90 seconds before crashing into the Hotelissimo Hotel near the airport, erupting into a massive fireball. All 109 people on board and 4 on the ground were killed. The investigation uncovered a devastating chain of events. Just 5 minutes before Concorde's takeoff, a Continental Airlines DC-10 had dropped a small titanium strip onto the runway. When Concorde accelerated over it, one of its tires burst. Fragments of rubber struck the underside of the wing, puncturing the fuel tank. Escaping fuel ignited, triggered by sparks from the landing gear. That misplaced strip of titanium, installed improperly during maintenance, had doomed 113 lives. A Continental mechanic and his supervisor were charged with involuntary manslaughter. The airline was fined €200,000 and ordered to pay €1 million in damages to Air France, along with 70% of the related civil compensation. Following the crash, the entire Concorde fleet was grounded for safety modifications. Kevlar liners were added to the fuel tanks, new burst-resistant tires were fitted, and several other upgrades were made. But public confidence had already been shattered. Concorde had once held a flawless safety record, but the shock of Flight 4590 was too great to overcome. Passenger demand collapsed. Though service resumed for a time, the end was inevitable. On October 26, 2003, Concorde made its final flight from New York to London, officially closing the curtain on the era of commercial supersonic travel. Though it ended in tragedy, Concorde remains remembered with reverence. Several of the surviving aircraft now rest in aviation museums around the world, and memorabilia bearing the Concorde insignia remain coveted collector's items. A small but passionate group of enthusiasts still dreams of returning it to the skies, though such a revival remains unlikely. To this day, Concorde holds the record for the fastest transatlantic passenger flight, a record that may stand for decades to come. Whether remembered as a symbol of speed, a triumph of engineering, or the heartbreaking end of a dream, Concorde will never be forgotten. Number 4. The destruction of Pompeii. Around October 17, 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius, AASA, a volcano in southern Italy, erupted with catastrophic force. Ash, pumice, and toxic gases shot high into the atmosphere before cascading back down as a deadly rain that smothered the countryside for miles in every direction. By the second day, pyroclastic surges, SUR, superheated clouds of volcanic gas and debris, swept across the region, both obliterating and, paradoxically, preserving in exquisite detail the Roman city of Pompeii. The area that became Pompeii had been inhabited for centuries before the Romans arrived. What began as a Neolithic settlement evolved into a Greek trading post and changed hands several times over the ages. Finally, around 80 BC, after a failed rebellion by the local population, Pompeii was annexed as an official Roman colony. It was already a prosperous city, NDT, and under Roman rule, that prosperity flourished even further. Magnificent public buildings rose across the city. An aqueduct was constructed to bring fresh water from the surrounding hills, and Pompeii became home to one of the earliest stone amphitheaters in the Roman Empire. At its height, the city may have housed as many as 20,000 residents. There were grand theaters, public and private bathhouses, bustling marketplaces, administrative centers, and luxurious villas adorned with mosaics and frescoes. Pompeii's wealth came from many sources. The surrounding farmland was fertile and ideal for agriculture, while its location along the beautiful Bay of Naples made it a favorite retreat for Rome's upper class, who built lavish vacation estates in and around the city. Pompeii was also a thriving trade hub. Ships from across the Mediterranean brought goods to its docks, making it both a center of commerce and culture. Life there was remarkably comfortable by ancient standards. Aside from a few notable disruptions, such as the earthquake of 62 AD, and a violent riot in the amphitheater 7 years earlier, Pompeii remained prosperous. All of that changed in October of 79, when Vesuvius erupted. The first sign the citizens likely felt was a series of strong tremors. Earthquakes were common, but what followed was anything but ordinary. As the ground settled, the sky darkened with ash, and hot stones began to rain down. At first they were small, but soon grew larger and more dangerous. As night fell, chunks of pumice the size of fists pelted the city. Many residents began to flee, gathering their families, collecting valuables, and escaping by horse-drawn carts or on foot. Within a single day, Pompeii's population dwindled to only a few thousand. Those who fled had made the right choice. By the following morning, pyroclastic flows began roaring down the slopes of Vesuvius. Dense, fast-moving torrents of superheated gas and ash that incinerated and buried everything in their path. Those who remained stood no chance. Homes were swallowed, streets were filled, and city walls were overtopped by the rushing flood of molten debris. The surges moved so quickly that many victims were entombed in the very positions they died, their final moments frozen in time. One of the few eyewitnesses to leave a written account was the Roman author and lawyer Pliny the Younger. Watching the eruption from the nearby city of Misenum, he and his mother narrowly escaped with their lives. He later wrote, "I looked back and saw a dense black cloud rolling toward the land behind us like a flood. Let us leave the road while we can still see," I said, "or we shall be crushed by the crowd." We had scarcely sat down to rest when darkness overtook us. Not the darkness of a moonless or cloudy night, but as if every lamp in a closed room had been extinguished at once. We could hear the shrieks of women, the wailing of children, the shouts of men. Some were calling for their parents, others for their children or their wives, trying to recognize each other by their voices. Many prayed for death in their terror of dying. Some called upon the gods, others declared that the gods had fled and that eternal night had fallen upon the world. There were those who added to real terrors with imaginary ones. Rumors spread that part of Misenum had collapsed or was on fire, and though untrue, they were believed. A faint light appeared, which we took for approaching flames rather than daylight. Soon, the darkness fell again, and ash began to rain down, now thicker than before. From time to time, we had to stand up and shake it off, or we would have been buried alive. I could boast that I felt no fear, but the truth is, I only endured it with the comfort that the whole world was perishing with me. At last, the darkness thinned into smoke, and daylight returned, though dim, like the sun in eclipse. Everything around us had changed. We were surrounded by a white blanket of ash, as if snow had fallen. We returned to Misenum, spending a night of anxiety, torn between hope and fear. Fear prevailed, for the ground still shook, and those in panic cried out fresh prophecies of doom. Pliny the Younger survived, though clearly traumatized. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, perished after sailing across the bay to rescue those trapped near the burning city. When the eruption finally ceased, the pyroclastic flows cooled and hardened, sealing Pompeii beneath them. Emperor Titus provided relief funds, but the devastation was overwhelming. Some survivors returned, digging through the ash for valuables or the bodies of loved ones. Later evidence suggests looters also came, tunneling into the hardened layers in search of treasure. In truth, they were burrowing through a vast tomb. Modern estimates suggest that around 1,500 people died, though the exact number will never be known. Pompeii was never rebuilt. Over the centuries, it was forgotten, until its rediscovery in the 18th century. Through the painstaking work of hundreds of laborers, the buried city was gradually unearthed, revealing an astonishingly detailed snapshot of ancient Roman life. The searing heat of the pyroclastic flows had destroyed Pompeii, but also preserved countless details that would otherwise have vanished with time. Human remains cast in ash, brilliantly colored frescoes, opulent villas, even crude graffiti scrawled on the walls, all remarkably intact. Today, Pompeii is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. Excavations continue, and each year brings new discoveries that deepen our understanding of ancient Rome. The very force that destroyed Pompeii, EIT Day, the unstoppable torrent of fire and ash, became the reason its story endures, allowing later generations to glimpse, centuries later, a civilization frozen at the moment of its death. The story of Pompeii is now known worldwide. Yet few realize that Mount Vesuvius remains an active volcano. Its last major eruption occurred in 1944, spewing lava and ash that killed 26 people and forced tens of thousands to flee their homes. Since then, the population surrounding Vesuvius has grown dramatically. Today, more than 500,000 people live within the so-called danger zone. Modern seismic monitoring can now provide at least 2 weeks warning before another eruption. A disaster on the scale of Pompeii may never happen again, but the volcano that once erased an entire city from the earth has never truly gone silent. Number 5. The 2011 Ride of Steel accident. On July 8, 2011, a visitor riding the Ride of Steel roller coaster at Darien Lake Amusement Park in New York was thrown from his seat as the train crested its first hill. The man struck his head against the side of the train before plummeting to the ground, dying instantly from severe injuries. The investigation that followed concluded he never should have been allowed on the ride, but his decision to board that day, his final ride, went unchallenged by any park employee. Darien Lake's history began in 1955, when a large man-made lake near the town of Darien opened to the public. For just 50 cents, visitors could spend the day swimming, picnicking, and relaxing by the water. The spot quickly became a local favorite, expanding year after year with new attractions. By the 1960s, guests could rent rowboats, fish for trout in stocked ponds, ride horses along the lakeshore, or camp overnight. In the 70s, small amusement rides appeared: mini zoos, water slides, and miniature golf. By the early 80s, that modest lakeside retreat had transformed into a full-fledged amusement park. Its first large roller coaster opened in 1982, followed by many others. The 1990s saw rapid expansion with a hotel, a separate water park, and a massive outdoor concert venue. By 2011, Darien Lake had become one of New York's premier tourist destinations. Among its main attractions was Superman, Ride of Steel, later renamed simply Ride of Steel. Opened in 1999, it was tall enough to qualify as a hypercoaster, featuring a 212-foot drop, camelback hills, and double helices that delivered powerful G-forces over the 2-minute journey. From the day it opened, Ride of Steel drew thousands of thrill-seekers each day. Most had unforgettable experiences, save for one serious accident in its first week of operation. On May 16, 1999, just its second day open, a passenger was ejected from his seat as the train crested a small hill. He survived but suffered permanent spinal injuries that left him in constant pain and partially paralyzed. The cause was traced to his body size, which caused the safety restraint to lock in an incorrect position. At the time, Darien Lake was owned by Six Flags, which was ordered to pay $3.95 million in damages and retrofit the coaster with additional seatbelts. After that, the ride operated without incident for over a decade, until 2011. That summer, Sergeant James Hackemer visited Darien Lake with his family. He was an Iraq war veteran who had survived a devastating roadside bomb that claimed most of both legs and left him in a coma for 2 months. When he finally awoke, he had to relearn how to speak and eat. Despite everything, he remained remarkably optimistic, often telling other wounded soldiers, "Stay strong. You can get through this. It's hard, but it's worth it." He led an active life, attending sports games, dining with friends, and biking with a specially designed cycle. Still, Hackemer admitted that adjusting to his new reality was difficult. His trip to Darien Lake that day was likely an attempt to recapture a sense of normalcy, to enjoy a carefree afternoon with his family, and experience the thrill of amusement rides once more. He arrived around 2:30 p.m. with his sister, 2 young children, and a nephew. At the information booth, he asked which rides were safe for him. Staff gave him a pamphlet outlining safety rules for disabled guests, but he declined it, saying he already had one. They instructed him to board through the ride's exit gate, A standard accommodation for wheelchair users. One of the first rides they chose was Ride of Steel. Following the directions, Sergeant Hackemer and his nephew entered through the exit, allowing easier access but bypassing the height check area. Because he had lost both legs, he was technically below the minimum height requirement. Even so, he proceeded to the loading platform, politely declining staff assistance while his nephew helped him into the front row seat. Moments later, the train dispatched. The coaster climbed steadily toward its towering first hill, then plunged downward, racing through a series of curves and airtime humps. During one of these weightless moments, Hackemer was thrown from the train. Witnesses recalled his baseball cap lifting from his head. When he reached up instinctively to catch it, his body lifted clear of the seat and was ejected entirely. He struck the side of the train and fell to the ground below. Emergency crews arrived within minutes, but his injuries were fatal. The ride was immediately shut down for investigation. Inspectors found no mechanical faults. Instead, regulators determined that Hackemer should never have been permitted to ride. Warning signs posted at both the entrance and exit explicitly stated that riders must have both legs. Perhaps he had overlooked them, but the deeper question was, why no employee intervened? Hackemer had prosthetic legs, but he was not wearing them that day. His condition was obvious. Several employees noticed but said nothing. The investigation revealed that, although staff were trained to evaluate the eligibility of disabled guests, those lessons had not been reinforced regularly. Over time, many had forgotten or downplayed their importance. Encounters with double amputees were rare, and most of the employees were teenagers, the oldest only 21. Confronting an older, confident war veteran may have felt uncomfortable, especially when the safety rules were no longer fresh in their minds. Ride of Steel reopened later that month after the park added larger warning signs, retrained its staff, and introduced a new safety compliance officer position, responsible for ensuring employees applied all regulations correctly. Sergeant Hackemer's family later reached a confidential settlement with the park sufficient to secure his children's future. Though devastated by his loss, they chose to honor his life rather than dwell solely on the tragedy. They said the accident happened while he was doing something he loved. His sister reflected, "That day at Darien Lake, he was truly happy. For a brief moment, he felt free, maybe more normal than he had in 3.5 years." Number 6. The Lac-Mégantic disaster. In the early hours of July 6, 2013, a freight train that had been parked overnight on the main line near the small town of Nantes, Quebec, suddenly began to move. At first, it rolled slowly. Then it gathered speed, descending a gentle grade toward the nearby town of Lac-Mégantic. The train consisted of 72 tanker cars, each filled with crude oil. There was no one at the controls, and nothing to stop it. The runaway train was now hurtling toward a sleeping community, one that would soon witness one of the worst rail disasters in Canadian history. Founded in 1884, Lac-Mégantic had always been tied to the railroad. Situated at the junction of the Canadian Pacific and Quebec Central Railways, the town was once so vital to regional commerce that Canada's first Prime Minister visited it to promote the growth of the national rail system. Even in modern times, the railway remained the town's lifeline. Trains delivered raw materials to local factories and carried away finished goods, imbando, furniture, particle board, and more. Beyond its industry, Lac-Mégantic was also a scenic destination, known for the vast, sparkling lake that gave the town its name. On July 5, 2013, a freight train was making its eastbound journey across Canada. It had departed Newtown, North Dakota, bound for a refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. The train was massive, 72 tank cars carrying about 30,000 gallons, roughly 113,000 liters, of crude oil, hauled by 5 locomotives for sufficient power. As the train neared Lac-Mégantic that evening, dusk had fallen. The sole engineer, Tom Harding, was instructed to park the train at Nantes for the night, where another crew would take over the following morning. Harding was likely relieved to step off. The locomotives had been malfunctioning throughout the trip, emitting heavy, unusual smoke. Before leaving, he set the handbrakes on several locomotives and checked that they held the train in place, a critical step, since it was parked on a slight incline. He then contacted his employer, the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railway, MMA, to report the engine trouble. After discussion, the company decided to leave the train where it was until morning. Harding caught a taxi to his usual hotel in Lac Megantike, ending what he thought was an uneventful night. But just before dawn, a small fire broke out inside one of the locomotives. The cause wasn't clear at the time, but later investigators discovered it traced back to a poorly executed repair months earlier, one that had now led to a serious failure. Passing motorists saw the flames and called the fire department. Firefighters arrived, followed standard protocol, and shut down the locomotives to stop the flow of fuel. The fire was quickly extinguished. They then contacted MMA, whose maintenance crew inspected the site, found no remaining danger, and left at about 12:15 a.m. on July 6th. At that moment, the train was stationary, the fire out, the engines quiet. Everything seemed under control. It was not. The train was held in place by two braking systems, mechanical handbrakes and air brakes powered by compressed air. When the locomotives were shut down, the compressors that sustained the air pressure also stopped. As the air slowly leaked out, the pressure dropped until the air brakes could no longer hold the train. Minutes after the firefighters departed, the enormous freight train began to move. Unmanned, it rolled downhill, gaining speed with every passing second. It roared through crossings, startling late-night drivers who saw a silent, headlightless train racing by. By the time it reached Lac Mégantic, it was traveling at roughly 65 miles per hour, far too fast for the curve that led directly into the heart of the town. There were no lights, no warning, only sparks and the screech of steel. The train derailed near an intersection. Cars jackknifed and piled atop one another. Crude oil gushed out, igniting into a firestorm that witnesses later described as a tsunami of flame sweeping through downtown. Residents ran for their lives. Some leapt from windows to escape, but the fire spread too quickly. Entire blocks were engulfed. Burning oil poured into basements and storm drains. Among the hardest-hit locations was the Music Café, a popular bar crowded with patrons that night. The entire building was consumed. Only those who ran at the first sound of impact survived. Others mistook the explosion for an earthquake and sought shelter indoors. None of them lived. More than 100 firefighters were mobilized. They faced an inferno fed by vast quantities of fuel, burning unpredictably as it traveled through drainage systems and erupted beneath distant streets. Despite the chaos, emergency crews worked tirelessly, blocking sewer inlets, setting fire breaks, spraying foam and water to cool the remaining cars before they could explode. Among those on the scene was Tom Harding himself, too, the engineer who had parked the train. From his hotel, he saw the flames rising into the night sky and called his superiors, horrified to learn the truth. He rushed to the site and joined local crews, operating heavy machinery to pull still intact tankers away from the blaze, preventing even greater devastation. The local hospital prepared for mass casualties, but only a handful of survivors arrived. Most victims had perished instantly. In total, 47 people were killed. More than 30 buildings were destroyed, and thousands of residents and hundreds of businesses were displaced. The fires burned for nearly 2 days before finally being extinguished. The subsequent investigation revealed a cascade of failures. Harding had set only 7 handbrakes, barely half the number required for a train of that weight. He also tested them incorrectly. By leaving the air brakes engaged, he couldn't verify whether the handbrakes alone could hold the train. 3 employees, including Harding, were charged with 47 counts of criminal negligence causing death. Yet public outrage focused less on them than on MMA Railway itself, a company long criticized for poor training, ignoring safety warnings, using outdated cars, deferring maintenance, and cutting costs at the expense of safety. Ultimately, all 3 men were acquitted. MMA Railway went bankrupt soon after, laying off most of its workforce. In the aftermath, both Canada and the United States enacted sweeping reforms for rail safety, ARIES, governing overnight parking, maintenance standards, and the transportation of hazardous materials. Many companies were now required to assign at least 2 qualified crew members to trains carrying flammable cargo, and to implement new safeguards for unattended trains. Even today, Lac Mégantic bears the scars of that night. Much of its downtown was lost, including the Music Café, the library, and numerous civic buildings. Some were rebuilt elsewhere, but the original center remains contaminated and largely abandoned. The railway still operates, but each year, on July 6th, every train passing through Lac-Mégantic stops for a brief, solemn moment of silence in memory of the 47 souls lost and a community forever changed. And that is the story for today. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you enjoy videos like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you receive a notification each time we release a new one.